Everyone in the ton knew the Duke of Godfrey had traded his wife for a mistress. They whispered about it over champagne flutes, gossiped behind carriage curtains, and wondered what a woman of such ethereal beauty had ever done to deserve such calculated cruelty from her own husband. But the truth was darker and far more devastating. The Duke didn't neglect Lady Catherine because she was unworthy. He neglected her because acknowledging her quiet devotion, her hauntingly soft gaze, the way her blonde hair caught the candlelight like spun gold, would have forced him to confront the prison he had built from his own pride. He watched her fade into the shadows of his estate with a deliberate coldness no one could understand, reducing her to a ghost while elevating Danbury to a throne that was never hers to claim, terrified by the reality that the wife he had buried in indifference was the only woman who had ever truly loved him. This is the story of a man who spent 3 years pretending she was nothing, only to discover she was everything the moment he saw her floating in the lake. To understand the cruelty, one must understand the resentment that came before it. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. 3 years ago, before he became known as the Duke who chose a mistress over a diamond, he was simply Caldwell Godfrey. He had inherited his title at 22, already hardened by expectations, standing in the chapel of his family estate with duty crushing the last remnants of his youth. He was striking even then, with dark hair that framed his sharp features and eyes that held a dangerous intensity. He looked down the aisle at Lady Catherine Bellamy, and all he could see was the end of his freedom, another obligation in a life already suffocating under the weight of his name. The two families had orchestrated the union for months, merging fortunes and securing alliances as equals. Caldwell assumed the marriage would be bearable, never suspecting that his own bitterness was about to poison the woman standing before him in white silk, transforming their bond into something unspeakably cold. The wedding took place in the spring of 1819. The ceremony was flawless, attended by every notable family in England, a display of wealth and tradition that should have marked the beginning of a powerful dynasty. Lady Catherine was only 19 years old, and while she was one of the most sought-after women in society, her beauty could offer no protection from what was to come. There was never a question of what would happen after the vows were spoken. Caldwell's mother, the Dowager Duchess, had orchestrated every detail with precision. Catherine would take her place as the new Duchess of Godfrey, mistress of the grand estate, the perfect ornament to her son's legacy. Catherine didn't arrive at Godfrey Manor unprepared. She stepped out of the wedding carriage wearing the finest ivory silk, clutching a pearl-handled fan her mother had given her, looking every bit the perfect aristocratic bride. But when she looked up at the imposing stone facade of her new home, the loneliness in her eyes betrayed her composure. Caldwell stood at the top of the entrance stairs, 25 years old, and already perfecting the art of emotional detachment behind a mask of ducal authority. But when he saw the young woman who had just pledged her life to him, standing there graceful and trying to offer him a hopeful smile, he felt something dangerous stir in his chest, something that felt too much like vulnerability. He walked down the stone steps, ignoring the waiting servants, and stopped directly in front of her. He didn't take her hand like a devoted husband. He looked past her, his jaw set with cold determination. "Welcome to Godfrey Manor," he said, his voice steady and empty. Then he turned and walked inside, leaving her standing alone on the steps, the first wound in a marriage that would bleed for 3 years until the night he found her floating in the lake like a dying lily, finally understanding that in choosing Danbury, he had destroyed the only woman who could have saved him from himself. The chapel bells rang through the spring air like a pronouncement of doom. Caldwell Godfrey stood at the altar in 1819, 25 years old and already weary of a life dictated by bloodlines and duty. He watched Catherine Bellamy walk toward him, her ivory gown trailing behind her like spilled moonlight, her blonde hair woven with pearls that caught the morning sun streaming through stained glass windows. She was breathtaking in a way that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. When she reached him and offered a trembling smile, hope flickering in her soft gray eyes, he deliberately looked away, fixing his gaze on the Archbishop instead. He heard her small intake of breath, felt the smile die on her lips. The vows were spoken in his voice, flat and perfunctory, as if he were reading from a ledger rather than binding his soul to another. When the time came to kiss his bride, he brushed his lips against her cheek with the warmth of marble, then turned to face the congregation with ducal composure. Catherine stood beside him, trembling like a candle flame in a draught, and he pretended not to notice the way her fingers clutched her bouquet until the stems bruised her palms. The guests applauded. The marriage was sealed. And Caldwell had delivered his first calculated cruelty to the woman who would spend 3 years loving a man determined to remain stone. The months bled into years within Godfrey Manor's imposing walls, and Catherine learned to move through her own home like a phantom seeking permission to exist. Caldwell had established the rules of their arrangement without ever speaking them aloud. They maintained separate chambers on opposite wings of the estate. He took his meals in the study, she in the dining room, their plates growing cold in solitary silence. When they crossed paths in hallways, he would nod with the distant courtesy one might offer a housekeeper, then continue past her as if she were merely another portrait hanging on the ancestral walls. Catherine had tried, in those early months, to reach him. She had waited for him in the drawing-room with books she thought he might enjoy, had ordered his favorite dishes prepared, had worn gowns in shades she'd heard him once admire. Each overture met with the same glacial indifference, until she finally understood that her husband's coldness was not thoughtless neglect but deliberate architecture. The servants whispered about the beautiful Duchess who drifted through corridors at twilight, her footsteps soft as snow, speaking to no one, wanted by no one. She became a living ghost in a house that should have been hers to command, fading a little more each day while Caldwell watched from behind his fortress of resentment, convinced that keeping her at a distance was somehow protecting himself from the dangerous pull of her quiet devotion. If this tale has stirred your curiosity, a simple like and subscription is most appreciated. And if you wish, share in the comments where you are listening from. Now, let us return to the story. Danbury arrived in the autumn of the 2nd year, and with her came the final desecration of Catherine's marriage. She was a widow from a lesser family, dark-haired and sharp-featured, with calculating eyes that assessed Godfrey Manor like a general surveying territory to conquer. Caldwell installed her in the estate's cottage, a charming stone building visible from Catherine's bedroom window, where she could watch her husband's carriage arrive each evening like clockwork. The affair was conducted with such brazen openness that it became a scandal that travelled through every drawing-room in London. Caldwell began bringing Danbury to dinners Catherine was meant to host, seating his mistress at the table while his wife stood frozen in the doorway, dismissed with a curt wave of his hand. At the theatre, he would arrive with Danbury on his arm, relegating Catherine to sit 3 boxes away with distant cousins, forcing her to watch him lean close to whisper in another woman's ear, to see him smile at Danbury in ways he had never smiled at his own wife. The humiliation was methodical and complete. Catherine stopped attending social events altogether, stopped trying to maintain the pretense of a marriage that existed only on legal documents. She retreated deeper into silence, and Caldwell told himself it was what he wanted, even as something dark and unsettled began to twist in his chest each time he glimpsed her pale face at a window, watching him leave for the cottage where Danbury waited. But Catherine could not hide forever. The summer gala at Godfrey Manor was an annual tradition, one she was obligated to attend as Duchess. She appeared at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of midnight blue silk that transformed her from ghost to goddess, her blonde hair swept up to reveal the elegant column of her throat, diamonds glittering at her ears like captured starlight. Caldwell was standing with Danbury near the champagne fountain when the conversations around them began to fade, replaced by a collective intake of breath. He turned, following the gaze of every man in the ballroom, and saw his wife descending the stairs with a grace that made his heart stop. Lord Ashworth moved toward her immediately, offering his arm with a reverence Caldwell had never shown her. Others followed, circling Catherine like moths drawn to a flame they'd never noticed burning. Caldwell watched young Viscount Hartley make her laugh, actually laugh, her face transforming with genuine joy, and something savage and possessive roared to life inside him. For 3 years he had worked to make her invisible, and now he saw her as they did, ethereal, untouchable, devastatingly beautiful, and felt desire slice through him with the force of betrayal. Danbury's hand tightened on his arm, her voice sharp in his ear, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from Catherine as she waltzed with another man, finally radiant in a way he had spent years trying to extinguish. The ruin came swiftly, born from Danbury's jealous rage and Caldwell's catastrophic choice. Catherine's grandmother's music box, an heirloom of delicate porcelain painted with roses, sat on display in the gallery. Danbury, flushed with wine and spite after watching Caldwell's eyes follow Catherine all evening, swept the box from its pedestal with a deliberate motion, sending it crashing to the marble floor where it shattered into irreparable fragments. Catherine stood frozen in the doorway, her face draining of color as she stared at the destruction of one of her last connections to the family who had loved her before this marriage became her prison. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "That was my grandmother's." Danbury laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the gallery. "It was hideous anyway, darling. I did you a favor." Catherine turned to Caldwell then, her eyes pleading for just one moment of solidarity, one word of defense from the husband who had vowed to honor her. He looked at his wife's devastated face, at Danbury's triumphant smirk, and made his choice. "Catherine, you're being dramatic. It was just an old box." The words landed like physical blows. Catherine's composure finally shattered along with the heirloom. She fled the ballroom without another word, and Caldwell returned to Danbury's side, ignoring the disgusted stares of guests who had witnessed his final, unforgivable betrayal. Caldwell found her just after dawn, when mist still clung to the surface of the estate's lake like a shroud. At first, he thought she was a trick of the light, a swan perhaps, something pale and beautiful drifting among the lily pads. Then his vision sharpened with horrible clarity. Catherine floated face up in the water, her white nightgown billowing around her like petals, her blonde hair fanning out in the current, her eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. The scream that tore from his throat was animal, raw with terror he had never allowed himself to feel. He crashed into the lake, the cold water shocking his system as he reached for her, pulling her limp body against his chest. She was ice-cold, her lips tinged blue, no breath stirring in her lungs. He carried her to the shore, stumbling and frantic, laying her on the grass as he pressed his mouth to hers, breathing air into her still body with desperate, broken prayers. "Catherine, please. Please don't leave me. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry." He pushed on her chest the way he'd once seen a physician do, again and again, until water finally spilled from her lips and she gasped, a terrible rattling sound that was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed, before closing again. He gathered her into his arms and ran for the manor, shouting for doctors, for help, for salvation he no longer deserved. The fever came that night, burning through Catherine's frail body with merciless intensity. The physician worked frantically while Caldwell refused to leave her bedside, this man who had spent 3 years avoiding his wife now clinging to her limp hand as if his grip alone could anchor her to life. In his vigil, searching desperately for some explanation, some reason why his wife would wade into that lake, he found Danbury's letters hidden in Catherine's writing desk. They were a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, each one designed to isolate and destroy. Letters to Catherine's family members, forged in Catherine's hand, declining invitations and severing connections. Letters to the household staff, supposedly from Catherine, ordering them to report her activities to Danbury. Letters to Catherine herself, unsigned, calling her worthless, unwanted, suggesting the world would be better if she simply disappeared. The evidence spilled across the desk like accusations, years of systematic torment designed to drive Catherine to the very edge Danbury had pushed her toward. Caldwell's hand shook as he read each poisonous line, understanding finally the true depth of what he had allowed to happen. He had given Danbury the power to destroy his wife, had stood by while she wielded it with surgical precision, and Catherine had endured it all in silence, loving him still until she couldn't endure any more. Caldwell found Danbury in the cottage, packing her belongings with unhurried confidence, clearly expecting him to smooth over yet another scandal. He stood in the doorway, and the look on his face made her pause, some instinct of self-preservation finally awakening. "Get out," he said, his voice quiet and more dangerous than shouting. "Caldwell, darling, surely we can," I said, "get out." He advanced into the room, his composure fracturing to reveal the rage beneath. "You tried to kill her. You tormented my wife for 2 years, isolated her, broke her, and I was too blind and too cruel to see it." He threw the letters at her feet like the garbage they were. "The carriage is waiting to take you back to London. You will never return to this estate. You will never speak my name or hers again. If I hear even a whisper that you've tried to contact me or spread lies about Catherine, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you completely." Danbury's face twisted with fury and fear. "You're choosing her? After everything?" "She's nothing, Caldwell. She's weak and pathetic, and she is my wife." He cut her off, the words a vow he should have made 3 years ago. "And you are nothing to me. You never were." He watched her leave, taking with her the last remnants of the man who had been fool enough to mistake cruelty for strength. Catherine woke on the 7th day, her eyes opening slowly as consciousness returned like a reluctant tide. Caldwell was there, as he had been every moment since pulling her from the lake, unshaven and hollow-eyed from sleepless nights of vigil. When her gaze focused on his face, she didn't smile or speak. She simply looked at him with those grey eyes that had once held so much hope, now empty of everything except exhausted resignation. "Catherine," he whispered, and then his composure, that ducal armor he had worn for so long, finally shattered completely. He fell to his knees beside her bed, his head bowing until his forehead pressed against her hand. "I'm sorry. God forgive me, I'm so sorry." The tears came then, years of frozen emotion breaking free. "I spent 3 years punishing you for a crime you never committed, hating you for making me feel vulnerable, choosing cruelty because I was too much of a coward to choose love. You deserved everything I never gave you, or devotion, protection, the faithfulness I vowed and then destroyed. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve another chance. But I'm begging you, Catherine. Please don't leave me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that the man who neglected you was a fool, and the man kneeling before you now would burn the world down before letting anyone hurt you again." If this story has captured your interest, please like the video and subscribe for more. Thank you.